James Hayes stood in the warmth of his study, watching the frost carve delicate patterns on the windowpane. Below, the yard was a quiet, frozen expanse. His foreman, Tom Barker, moved from one ranch hand to the next, handing them their year-end bonuses. Each man touched his hat in acknowledgement, slid the envelope into his coat, and walked off. No one smiled. No one spoke. James let out a breath, fogging the glass in front of him. He turned back to his desk, where his pen scratched across several envelopes: church donation, widow's fund, orphanage contribution. He didn't even pause to think about the numbers. Generous amounts, yes, but automatic. He signed off, tucked each envelope in its appropriate slot, and pushed them aside. Christmas obligations, checked and complete. Mr. Hayes? He looked up to see Martha, his housekeeper, standing in the doorway, her hands wringing nervously. She was a soft-spoken woman, quick to attend to his needs but never one to trouble him with much. "I hate to bother you, sir, but it's Sarah Brennan," she said, her voice tinged with concern. "I passed by her place last night, and her chimney was smoking something awful. Green wood, I'd wager. Looks like she's burning fence posts to stay warm." James frowned, pushing his chair back with a soft scrape against the hardwood. Sarah Brennan, the widow who'd moved to town 2 years ago after her husband passed. She was quiet, self-sufficient, too proud, the gossip went. She took in laundry for others but never asked for help. "I'll handle it," James said, his voice sharp enough to end the conversation. Martha nodded, though her concern still lingered in her eyes. She left him alone with his thoughts. James reached into the drawer of his desk, pulling out a fresh envelope. He counted out $50, enough for proper firewood through the winter, plus a bit for other necessities. He folded the bills carefully, sealed the envelope, and scrawled her name across the front. As he did, his reflection caught in the window. His hair, dark once, now carried streaks of silver. The lines around his eyes had deepened, though he still looked the part of a successful man. Generous, too. The kind of man who took care of his community. At least, that's what he told himself. He stood, pulling his coat over his shoulders. It was a cold morning, one that made you feel the weight of winter creeping into your bones. He walked to the stables. The barn smelled of hay and leather, the warm, earthy scent, a stark contrast to the frigid air outside. His horse was ready, waiting patiently, its hooves tapping softly on the stone floor. The ride into town was quiet. 40 minutes on horseback, the hooves crunching through snow-covered earth. The fence lines stretched out beside him like silent sentinels, marking the land he had built. Hayes Ranch, 10,000 acres, 200 head of cattle, a dozen men on the payroll. He had earned everything, or so he thought. As he crested the ridge, the small town came into view. Sarah's place was on the far side, a modest cabin that seemed worn down by both time and the land. The thin column of smoke rising from her chimney caught his eye, but there was something about the way it curled into the air, desperate, like a woman doing everything she could to keep warm but falling short. He touched the envelope in his coat pocket. The wealthy man's burden, his father had once told him, was knowing when to give. James had always prided himself on that wisdom. He gave strategically, generously, appropriately. It had always been easy that way. He urged his horse forward. Sarah Brennan was kneeling before a fire, coaxing life from damp wood that hissed and smoked, stubborn against the cold. The chimney let out a bitter sigh, swirling smoke back into the room. Sarah's eyes watered, her hands red from scrubbing laundry and fetching water. The small stack of firewood beside her hearth dwindled. It wouldn't last long. She looked at the pile, calculating the days ahead. 3 days, maybe 4, before she'd have to find more. She heard the knock on her door. Startled, she rose slowly, smoothing down her worn dress before opening it. Standing in the doorway was James Hayes, the richest man in the county. He tipped his hat, his face soft with concern, but his eyes, she noticed, were also filled with the kind of pity she hated. "Mrs. Brennan," he said, his voice carrying that tone of authority that came with wealth and position. "Cold morning. May I come in for a moment?" Sarah stepped aside. He dismounted quickly, his boots crunching in the snow. He tied his horse and entered, his eyes sweeping over her humble home. It was small and sparsely furnished, but clean. The floor was swept, the quilt on her bed carefully patched, the Bible beside her pillow. James was already speaking, his words spilling out without pause. "Winter's hard on folks, especially those alone. I know you're managing, but I'd rest easier knowing you had what you needed." He pulled out the envelope, setting it on her small table. $50 for wood and supplies, he said, almost matter-of-factly. "Consider it a community responsibility, neighbors helping neighbors through hard times." Sarah didn't touch the envelope. Instead, she looked at it, her hands steady as she studied the man in front of her. She knew what this was, charity wrapped in pity. The rich man solving a problem he noticed while passing by. He had already dismissed her pride before she even spoke. "That's very kind of you, Mr. Hayes," she said, her voice flat. James smiled, a practiced, generous smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "No need to thank me. Just stay warm, Mrs. Brennan." He turned and walked out before she could offer anything more. The door clicked shut behind him. Sarah stood there, alone again in the quiet of her cabin. The fire crackled in the corner, but the room felt colder now. She walked to the table, picked up the envelope, and broke the seal. She counted the bills, $50, the amount he had decided would solve her problem. Her jaw tightened as she folded the money carefully, tucking it back into the envelope. She placed it beside her Bible. Outside, the wind howled against the walls of the cabin, rattling the window. Inside, something harder than pride settled in her chest. "I didn't ask for this," she whispered to the empty room. She could feel it now, that old familiar ache, the loneliness, the struggle, but the pride too. It was hers to carry. The money would have made life easier, but it wasn't hers to accept. Not from him, not like this. She wrapped her shawl tighter around her shoulders and sat by the fire, watching it struggle to stay alive. Tomorrow, she would return his money. Tonight, she would burn the fence posts and be grateful for the warmth. The next morning came with a sharp bite in the air, the sun barely breaking through the overcast sky. James had returned to his study, a morning of work awaiting him, but he couldn't focus. His thoughts kept drifting to Sarah, her quiet refusal, the way she had looked at him when he offered the money, the weight of that silent exchange. His conscience was unsettled, something gnawing at the edges of his mind. The envelope he had left on the desk sat unopened. He could still see Sarah's face when he left, her eyes steady and calm. She hadn't asked for charity, yet he had given it without a thought, as though that was the answer to everything. "Martha," he called, lifting his gaze from the desk. She appeared almost immediately, her expression cautious, as if sensing his discontent. "Yes, Mr. Hayes?" "I need to know when Mrs. Brennan returned the envelope." Martha looked surprised. "Early this morning, sir. She walked it over herself." "Before dawn, I believe." I offered her coffee, but she refused. "Walked?" James repeated, his eyes narrowing. 5 miles in the snow?" "Yes, sir." "She brought it back this morning, said it wasn't necessary." James looked at the envelope again, the neat script on the front. It had been returned, each bill folded with care, each dollar counted and accounted for. He felt his stomach tighten. There was something about this, something that gnawed at him. His charity had been returned, but not with gratitude. It was a rejection, plain and simple. He stood up, the thought of his next steps already forming in his mind. This wasn't just about money. It was something more, and for some reason he couldn't shake the feeling that he needed to make this right. By mid-afternoon, James was riding back into town, the cold wind biting through his coat. He had formulated a plan. He needed to see Sarah not just as the widow in need, but as a woman with pride and dignity. And he needed to offer something real this time, something that didn't make her feel small. His horse's hooves crunched along the snow-covered road, the journey feeling longer than it should have. As he neared Sarah's cabin, he saw her standing outside, her hands busy with something, perhaps mending or tending to the yard. The cabin still looked humble, but there was a quiet beauty in the way she managed it. She had made do, time and time again, never asking for help, never giving up. He admired that, But that admiration didn't stop the discomfort growing inside him. He had been wrong. He had treated her like a project. Charity dressed up as pity. He couldn't ignore that truth anymore. He tied his horse by the fence and walked toward the porch. Sarah saw him coming, and for the briefest moment, he thought he saw her stiffen. But she didn't turn him away. She stood there, waiting. "Mrs. Brennan," he said, tipping his hat. "I hope I'm not disturbing you." She simply nodded. "Mr. Hayes." There was a long silence between them, the kind that made James feel like a stranger in his own world. He cleared his throat. "I've been thinking about our conversation yesterday," he said, "and I realize I made a mistake. I didn't understand what you needed." Sarah raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" "I meant to offer help, but instead I offered something that stripped you of your dignity." He paused, looking down at the ground for a moment. "That wasn't what I intended." Sarah didn't respond immediately. She watched him, her face unreadable. "I need to make this right," James continued, his voice firm but quiet. "And I think I've found a way." Sarah crossed her arms over her chest. "How do you mean?" "I know you're a skilled seamstress," he said, his words coming with more certainty now. "I have some work I need done. Curtains for my guest room. Something fresh for the new year." She eyed him with skepticism, but there was a flicker of curiosity in her gaze. "What's wrong with the ones you already have?" "Nothing at all," James replied, a slight smile tugging at his lips. "But I'm looking for something different. I need new curtains. If you're willing to take the commission, I'll pay you for the work." "Fairly." She was quiet for a moment, then nodded slowly. "I'll take the measurements and see what you need. I'll come by this afternoon." James let out a breath of relief. It was a start, a small step, but real work. He had no intention of making it easy this time. He was offering her an opportunity to earn what she needed, something she could take pride in. When Sarah arrived at his house later that afternoon, James greeted her at the door. He led her inside, through the large, empty rooms of his home. It felt cold, distant, a place of wealth without warmth. But that was changing, he hoped. "Let me show you the guest room," he said, as they ascended the staircase. She followed, walking slowly, her eyes moving over the furnishings, noting the pristine condition of everything. It was a home built for show, not for living. James led her into the guest room, where the curtains hung undisturbed. They were plain but functional. But Sarah's eyes didn't miss the detail. She knew the truth. These curtains didn't need replacing. He was asking her to do something that wasn't necessary, but he was giving her the chance to do it anyway. "You have fine curtains already," Sarah said, her voice measured but calm. James looked at her, a slight frown on his face. "They're fine, yes, but they could be fresher. A change for the new year." She studied him for a moment, her gaze steady. "I'll get the measurements." "What color would you prefer?" "Something that feels fresh," he said. "You've got good taste. I trust you." She nodded and began measuring the windows, her hands moving deftly as she worked. James stood back, watching her, unsure of what to say. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable, but it was a silence born of realization. She finished the measurements and looked up at him. "I'll have them done by the 28th. $20 for both windows. Fair price." James nodded. "That's fine. Generous, even." She turned to leave, and for the first time, James felt something stirring in him. This wasn't charity. It was something else, something more. She was doing work, real work, and he was paying her what she deserved. And in that moment, he realized it wasn't about the curtains. It was about seeing her for who she truly was. 2 days later, Sarah returned to James' house, carrying a small, neatly wrapped package in her hands. He was in his study when she arrived, and when he heard the knock on the door, he stood, feeling that familiar sense of anticipation. It wasn't about the curtains anymore. It was about something more personal, something deeper. He opened the door, and there she stood, her face calm, but there was something about the way she held herself that made him pause. She wasn't just the widow anymore, the woman struggling to survive. She was someone else, someone who had earned his respect without him even realizing it. "Mrs. Brennan?" James said, stepping aside to let her in. "Mr. Hayes." She replied, her voice steady, though there was a slight hesitation as she crossed the threshold. She handed him the package, the paper smooth and crisp in his hands. He unwrapped it carefully, revealing the two curtains, deep blue with subtle embroidery along the hems. They were beautiful, the kind of work you could tell had taken time, attention, and care. "These are excellent," James said, his admiration evident. He turned the curtains over in his hands, noting the fine stitching and the perfect color. It was clear that they were far more than what he had expected, far more than what he had deserved. Sarah stood silently, watching him examine the work. Her arms were crossed over her chest, her posture as unwavering as ever. "I'll pay you the full price," James said, placing the curtains down on the table. $20 for the work and materials. Quote. She reached into her apron pocket and pulled out an envelope, just as she had before. "Here's your change, Mr. Hayes," she said, her voice calm, but her words carrying a quiet weight. James took the envelope from her, a mixture of confusion and frustration rising within him. He opened it, his eyes scanning the contents. $15. His throat tightened as he looked up at Sarah. "The curtains cost $20, he said. "The materials alone were $5, she interrupted gently. "That's honest payment for the work." The words hit him harder than he expected. He stared at the money in his hands, his mind racing. It wasn't about the money. He knew that. It was about the principle behind it. "The rest is charity," Sarah continued, her eyes steady. "I won't take your charity dressed up as work. My labor isn't worth $15 for 2 days of sewing." She set the envelope down on his desk, the weight of it somehow heavier than before. "You've got a kind heart, Mr. Hayes, but I can smell pity no matter how you package it." Quote. James stood there for a long moment, feeling a sting that went deeper than the words themselves. It wasn't anger. It was a recognition of something he had failed to see, something he had been blind to all this time. She had refused his money before, and now she was refusing it again. But it wasn't out of spite. It was because she wasn't willing to be made small by him. She didn't need his pity, his handouts. She needed to be seen as an equal. "Thank you," he said quietly, his voice tight with emotion. Sarah nodded, her face unreadable. "You're welcome." She turned and walked toward the door, but before she left, she paused and looked back at him. "Mr. Hayes," she said, her voice softer now, "if you truly want to help me, stop trying to fix me. I'm not broken." James stood still, his hands shaking slightly as he looked at her, trying to absorb the weight of her words. She wasn't asking for his charity. She was asking for his respect, and for the first time he understood that what he had been offering wasn't help at all. It was an attempt to assuage his own guilt, to make himself feel better. As Sarah stepped out into the cold, James stood there, staring at the envelope on his desk. The $15 burned in his mind, the rejection that came with it cutting deeper than any thank you could have. He had never considered how his actions looked from her perspective, never thought about how his wealth, his generosity, could make someone feel small. She wasn't refusing help. She was refusing to be made into something she wasn't. The sound of his front door closing echoed in the empty hallway. He sank down into the chair behind his desk, feeling something heavy settle in his chest. The warmth of his study seemed distant now, almost suffocating in its emptiness. His wealth, his success, all of it, seemed meaningless in the face of what he had just learned. That evening, when James went to the sitting room, he found himself staring at the painting of his late wife, Catherine. She had hated that portrait, always saying it made her look too serious. But James had loved it. It was the clarity in her eyes, the strength in her gaze that had drawn him to it. What would she say about all this, he wondered. What would she say about the mess he had made of everything? He had thought he understood charity, thought he understood what it meant to give. But now, looking at the portrait of the woman who had always known him better than he knew himself, he wasn't so sure anymore. He thought back to the last conversation they had before her death, how she had scolded him for a donation he had made to the church, a donation that had been nothing more than a tax write-off, a way to buy the town's favor. "Giving what costs you nothing means nothing," Catherine had said to him. "You're giving from your excess, James, not from your life. The best gifts come from hands that have to get dirty giving them." He had been angry then, defensive, but now he could hear her words in his mind more clearly than ever before. He had given from his excess. He had given to buy goodwill, to avoid discomfort. But he hadn't truly given of himself. Not until now. James sat there for a long time, the house around him cold, silent. The $15 that Sarah had returned lay on the desk beside him. He looked at the bills, remembering how her hands had felt when she placed the money back in his palm. She had seen him, really seen him. And now, he was starting to see her. The next morning, as James walked to the stables, his thoughts were heavy. He had been wrong. He hadn't just offered charity. He had offered pity. He needed to fix that. And the only way to do that was by showing up, by being present, truly present. The sound of his horse's hooves broke through the quiet as he made his way back toward Sarah's cabin. It was time to put the lessons of the last few days into action. It was time to give something that cost him more than money. James was restless. The morning had barely begun, but already he found himself back in his study, pacing the floor. His hands felt clammy as he stood by the window, gazing out at the bleak horizon. His thoughts kept returning to Sarah, her pride, her strength, her refusal to accept anything less than respect. He hadn't seen her for days, and the more he thought about it, the more he realized how wrong he had been in his approach. The easy route wasn't the answer. She didn't need his charity. She needed to be treated as an equal. And the only way he could prove that was by meeting her on her terms, not his. James looked at his hands. They were soft, accustomed to holding reins and signing checks, not much else. He had worked hard to build his ranch, but that didn't make him any more capable of real labor. He sighed deeply and pushed away from the window, walking toward the door. By the time he reached Sarah's cabin, the sky had darkened with the approach of a late afternoon storm. Snowflakes had begun to swirl in the wind, but the chill didn't bother him. He had decided to give up the comfort of his life, if only for a moment, and face something real. Sarah was outside, just as he had expected, tending to something by her fence. Her hands were wrapped in cloth, but her posture was steady. She was used to this, used to doing it all herself. James couldn't help but watch her for a moment, the way she moved so confidently, even in the cold. There was something profoundly humbling about her quiet strength. She hadn't heard him approach, and he found himself standing there for a moment, unsure of what to say. He had never been good at these kinds of conversations. He was used to giving orders, not engaging on an equal footing. But today, he wasn't a rancher trying to solve someone's problem. He was a man, hoping to understand. "Mrs. Brennan," he called softly, stepping closer. She turned slowly, her face guarded but not unfriendly. "Mr. Hayes." I was hoping we could talk," James said, his voice rougher than he had intended. Sarah's eyes flicked down to his hands, the bloodstains still visible on the cloth where he had wrapped them from the work he had done. "You've been working?" she asked, her tone flat, but there was a hint of curiosity in her eyes. He nodded. "I've been thinking about what you said. I understand now. I don't know what you've been through, or what it's like to have to fight for every bit of dignity. But I know that I've never really earned anything that meant anything before. Not like you have." Sarah said nothing, but the way she watched him was different now, more understanding. "I need to make this right," he said, his words coming slower, more measured. "I need to do something real. So if you'll have me, I want to help you with the fence. I'll work beside you. I don't know how to do it properly, but I'll learn." For the first time in their interaction, Sarah looked him over, really looked at him. His coat was worn, his hands still unaccustomed to manual labor, but there was something in his eyes now that hadn't been there before. It wasn't pity, it wasn't pride. It was something far more genuine. "I don't need your charity, Mr. Hayes," she said softly, but the edge was gone from her voice. "I'm not offering charity, Mrs. Brennan," he replied. "I'm offering to work beside you, to see you as an equal." She didn't answer right away. Instead, she looked over at the fence, at the post that needed to be replaced, the wood that was already starting to rot, the ground frozen and unforgiving. And then, after a long pause, she nodded. "All right," she said, the faintest trace of a smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. "But don't expect me to go easy on you." They worked together through the afternoon, the air growing colder as the storm approached. James' hands were blistered before long, his muscles sore from the unfamiliar work. But he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. He was finally doing something that mattered. Sarah was steady beside him, moving with the kind of precision that came from years of experience. But as they worked, James noticed something else, a small shift in the way she carried herself. She wasn't just working to survive anymore. She was teaching him, showing him what it meant to do something with integrity, with sweat, with real effort. He was getting tired now, his coat caked with snow and mud, his hands aching, but there was something about this work that made him feel alive in a way he hadn't in years. He thought back to the charity he had offered, how easy it had been, how it hadn't cost him anything. This was different. This was raw and real. By the time the sun set, the fence was halfway finished. It wasn't perfect. Some posts leaned slightly, and the wire wasn't as tight as it should have been, but it was done. It would hold. Sarah stood back, surveying their work with quiet satisfaction. She didn't say anything for a long moment, just watched the fence, then glanced at James. "You did all right, Mr. Hayes," she said, the faintest trace of humor in her voice. "For someone who's never lifted a hammer." James grinned, feeling the exhaustion in his bones. "I've got a lot to learn," he said, his voice hoarse. "But I'll keep at it, Mrs. Brennan, until it's done right." Sarah nodded and turned toward her cabin. She didn't say anything more, but there was something in her gaze, something warmer, less guarded, that made James feel as though he had taken a small but significant step. As he mounted his horse and prepared to leave, Sarah called out to him, "Mr. Hayes." He turned, raising an eyebrow. "Thank you," she said, her voice soft but sincere. "For showing up. That's more than most would do." James smiled, feeling a strange warmth fill his chest. "I'll be back tomorrow," he said. "I'll finish the job." She nodded and went inside, leaving James alone in the falling snow. The wind had picked up, but for the first time in days he didn't mind. As he rode back toward his ranch, the world around him felt quieter, more real. He thought about the work he had done that day, about how it hadn't been easy, but it had been worthwhile. And for the first time, he truly understood what it meant to give, not money, not pity, but something of himself. The next few days passed slowly for James. He returned to Sarah's cabin each afternoon, his hands growing rougher and his muscles aching more with every post they set. The snowstorm had passed, but the cold lingered, cutting through his coat and biting at his skin. Yet none of that bothered him as much as it used to. The work was hard, but it was real. It felt like he was earning something for the first time in a long while. Earning Sarah's trust, earning his own sense of worth. By the third day, the fence was complete. It wasn't perfect, but it was sturdy, strong enough to withstand the wind and the weight of winter. Sarah had stood back, inspecting their work with a quiet nod, but she hadn't said much. That was the way of things with her. She didn't need to say much to make her point. Her actions spoke louder than any words. James stood back now, watching as Sarah straightened up from the last post. Her hands were still raw, but there was a sense of satisfaction in her eyes. The work was done, together. "You did well," she said quietly, wiping her brow. "I didn't expect you to last this long." Quote. James smiled, though his face felt stiff with the cold. "I didn't expect me to last this long either," he replied, "but I'm glad I did." She gave him a small, almost imperceptible smile, the kind of smile that meant more than words could express. "Thank you," she said after a moment, her voice softer than it had been before, "for staying, for doing what you said you would." James nodded. It wasn't about the fence anymore. It wasn't even about proving anything to her or to himself. It was about doing something because it was right. No expectation of reward, no need for recognition. Just doing something for someone else because that was what you did when you cared. "I meant it," James said quietly. "I'll keep coming back. I'll finish whatever you need. No more charity, just work." She looked at him for a long time, her gaze steady. Then, without another word, she turned and walked toward the cabin. James stood there for a moment, feeling a sense of peace settle in him. It wasn't the kind of peace that came from comfort, It was a quiet, hard-won kind of peace, the kind that came from respect. The next morning, he found himself awake before dawn, his thoughts already turning to Sarah and the work they had done together. He knew the town was still talking. People always talked. But now, it didn't matter. They had no idea what had truly transpired over the past few days. No one in town knew the effort it had taken for James to swallow his pride, to set aside his wealth, and to do the work that Sarah did every day. But that was fine. It wasn't for the town's approval that he had done this. It was for himself, for Sarah, and for the dignity they both deserved. As he rode to town, he passed by the church. The morning light was just beginning to break through the clouds, casting a soft glow on the snow-covered ground. The town was still asleep, but the street was starting to come alive. People would be gathering for the New Year's Eve celebration that evening, and James knew that Sarah would be there. He wasn't sure if he would be welcomed, but he didn't care. He was going to show up, not because of any obligation, but because he wanted to. By the time he arrived at the general store, the warmth inside was a welcome relief. He stepped in, tipping his hat to the storekeeper before moving toward the counter. As he reached for some supplies, he felt a tap on his shoulder. "Mr. Hayes." It was Sarah. She was standing in the doorway, her shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders. Her face was still guarded, but there was something different in her eyes now, something softer. "I wanted to thank you," she said, her voice quieter than usual, "for the work and for not giving up." James looked at her, his heart heavy with the weight of everything they had shared. "Thank you, Mrs. Brennan, for letting me help, for showing me what it really means to give." She looked at him for a moment, her lips curling into a faint smile. "I'm not easy to help," she said with a slight chuckle. "I've learned that," James replied, his smile genuine. There was a pause, and then Sarah spoke again, her voice low but clear. "You'll be at the gathering tonight?" James hesitated. He wasn't sure if he belonged there yet, not after everything, but something inside him told him he had earned the right to be there. "I'll be there," he said, his voice steady. Sarah nodded, then turned to leave, but before she stepped outside, she paused and looked back over her shoulder. "Don't be late," she said with a smile. James watched her walk out of the store, her figure growing smaller in the distance. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he had earned something real. He wasn't just the wealthy rancher anymore. He wasn't the man who gave out charity like it was a gift. He was a man who had worked, who had learned, who had earned his place. That evening, the town hall was filled with people. The warmth of the fire and the chatter of voices created a sense of community, of belonging. James found himself standing near the door, uncertain for a moment of where to go. But then he saw Sarah across the room, standing with a few other women. She caught his eye and nodded in his direction, and something about the way she looked at him made him feel welcome. Not because of his wealth, not because of anything he had done, but because she saw him for who he had become. James moved toward her, his heart lighter than it had been in years. They sat together at a table, surrounded by neighbors, friends, people who had been a part of his life for so long, but who had never really known him. Tonight, that was about to change. As the evening wore on, James found himself talking, laughing, listening in a way he hadn't in years. He didn't feel the weight of expectations or judgment. He just felt like a man among equals. When the evening came to a close, Reverend Thomas stood and offered a blessing. "As we close this year and open the next," he said, his voice filled with warmth, "we are reminded that the best gifts aren't found in our wallets, but in our willingness to show up for one another, to work beside each other, to sit at tables together as equals." His eyes met James and Sarah's across the room, and he smiled. "Sometimes we have to learn that charity isn't money given from comfort. It's life shared through discomfort. It's the gift that costs us who we thought we were so we can become who we're meant to be." As the crowd slowly began to thin, James found himself standing beside Sarah near the coat hooks. She smiled at him as he helped her with her shawl. "You've learned something important, Mr. Hayes," she said softly, her voice low enough for only him to hear. "I think I have," he replied, meeting her gaze. "I finally understand what it means to give." She laughed softly, her eyes sparkling. "It wasn't easy, was it?" Quote. James smiled, a quiet sense of peace settling in him. No, but it was worth it. As they walked out into the cold night, their footsteps crunched in unison through the snow, the silence between them comfortable. At Sarah's gate, James stopped. "Thank you," she said again, her voice sincere. "For everything." James nodded, his heart full. "Thank you for showing me what truly matters." They stood there for a moment, the sound of distant voices fading as the world around them grew quiet. For the first time, James didn't feel the weight of his wealth. He didn't feel the burden of what he had. He just felt connected to something real, connected to Sarah. And for the first time in years, he didn't feel alone. The days after the New Year's Eve gathering passed quickly, but the changes in James felt lasting. He had learned more in the past week than in the past few years, and the quiet, honest work alongside Sarah had awakened something in him that he didn't even know was missing. His life, once filled with the noise of wealth and expectations, now felt quieter, simpler, but more meaningful. The first morning after the gathering, James stood by the window of his study, watching the snow gently fall outside. It wasn't the usual sight he was used to. He saw it now through new eyes, eyes that had learned the value of real work and the humility that came with it. He could still hear Sarah's voice in his mind, reminding him that charity wasn't just giving money, it was about showing up, about truly seeing someone. He had never understood that before. The next few weeks passed without much fanfare. The fence at Sarah's place had held up well, and James continued to visit her, not as the rancher offering charity, but as a man who had learned something valuable. He worked beside her, mended her porch steps, helped her with repairs. There were no expectations between them, no debts owed, just mutual respect that grew with each day. James no longer looked at Sarah with pity. He looked at her with admiration. She was proud, strong, and fiercely independent, yet she had allowed him to share in her life, not as a savior, but as an equal. That was the greatest gift she had given him. As the months went by, their friendship deepened. Sarah came to trust him in ways she hadn't before. She didn't have to say much. Her actions spoke louder than any words could. She had learned that James wasn't just a wealthy rancher anymore. He was someone who saw her, not as a charity case, but as a woman with dignity, strength, and a story of her own. And in return, James began to understand what it meant to truly share, to truly give. It wasn't just about offering money. It was about giving time, effort, and understanding. And the more time they spent together, the more he realized there was something else in the air between them, something neither of them had expected. It was a cold day in February when James finally found the courage to speak what had been growing between them. He had just finished working on her porch, his hands aching from the unfamiliar labor. Sarah was inside, preparing a simple meal, beans, bread, and the warmth of the fire in her small cabin. James wiped his hands on his coat, feeling the weight of the moment. When Sarah called him inside, he hesitated at the door. His heart beat a little faster, and he couldn't help but feel the nerves that had been building up over the past few weeks. He hadn't planned this, hadn't expected it, but somehow it felt right. When he stepped inside, Sarah was standing by the fire, her back turned to him as she worked. "Mrs. Brennan," he began, his voice low. She turned, and he saw the soft smile on her face. "Mr. Hayes," she said, as if nothing had changed between them. But he knew better. He knew everything had changed. James took a step forward, and his voice faltered. "I've been thinking about us, about everything we've shared, and I can't help but wonder if there's more here than just friendship." Sarah paused for a long moment, her eyes meeting his. She had always been direct, never one to shy away from the truth. She had earned that right. "What are you saying, Mr. Hayes?" she asked, her tone soft but not uncertain. James swallowed hard, his heart in his throat. "I'm saying that I think I've fallen for you, Sarah. In a way I never expected." The silence between them was thick with everything they had shared. The work, the understanding, the quiet moments of connection. Sarah's expression didn't change, but there was something in her eyes that softened. "I didn't think you would feel the same," James continued, "but I can't deny it anymore. I want to be with you, not because I owe you anything, not because I feel sorry for you, but because I see you. I see the woman you are, and I admire you more than I can put into words." Quote. Sarah's gaze softened, but there was still caution there, something that made her take a step back. She was a woman who had been alone for so long, a woman who had learned to trust no one. She wasn't sure if she could trust him either, not completely. "I'm not asking you to make any promises," James said quickly, taking a step closer. I need you to know how I feel." Sarah studied him for a moment longer, her eyes searching his face as if weighing his words, and then slowly she nodded. "I've never needed anyone's charity, Mr. Hayes," she said, her voice steady. "But what you're offering is different. You're offering something real. I can't promise you anything either, but I'm willing to see where this can go, as long as you're not trying to fix me." "I'm not," James said, his voice thick with sincerity. "I promise." The air between them shifted then, as if something had clicked into place. Sarah stepped forward, closing the distance between them, and for the first time in a long time, she reached out to him. Not out of necessity, but out of choice. Her hand brushed against his, and for a moment, neither of them moved. The weight of the past few months, the work, the understanding, the slow-growing trust, hung between them. Then, without a word, Sarah leaned forward, her lips brushing against his in a soft, tentative kiss. James kissed her back gently, as though testing the waters, unsure of what was happening, but knowing, deep down, that it was everything he had been searching for. When they pulled apart, their foreheads rested against each other. The warmth of the fire behind them was nothing compared to the warmth they felt in that moment. "I think we've both earned this," Sarah said quietly, her eyes locked on his. James nodded, his heart full. "Yes," he whispered, "we have." As the months passed, their relationship grew deeper. They were no longer just two people from different worlds. They were two people who had found something in each other that they hadn't expected but had always needed. They continued to work side by side, learning from one another, building something real. And as the seasons changed, so did their lives. Slowly, but surely, they built a future together. And in the quiet of the evening, as they sat by the fire in Sarah's cabin, James knew one thing for sure. He had finally found the one thing that money couldn't buy: a life worth living, a love worth fighting for. If you felt this tale in your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Archives of the Wild West, where every story rides through the dust, the danger, and the kind of love that never dies. See you in the next tale, partner.